This video is going to be primarily focused on hearing, but it's going to be like super duper abbreviated. And if you've noticed in just itty bitty writing next to it, I wrote "ick" and equilibrium. I'm not trying to be a jerk, but I also feel like if we're going to mention stuff in this region of the head, I should just barely touch on it so that way you're not confused about the different structures within. But first, it's just all hearing, really. So let's just go into that hearing. I got a lot of things going on in here. We're going to divide it up into 3 parts. We're going to talk about the outer ear first, followed by a middle ear, and then finally this inner ear. Outer, middle, inner. Starting off with the outer. The outer is probably the one that we're the most familiar with. This is the one that we see daily on other people's heads and sometimes maybe even in the mirrors. Now, we always call this outer part the ear, but we need to kind of reclassify it because science, we love science, and science likes to name things fancy. So we got ourselves out here this more cartilaginous part that if you flick it, it bounces really quick right back into formation. That is called the helix. But this little dangly piece of flesh down here is called the lobule. Some of you all have it attached. Some of you all have it just simply dangling. Within that region, or in that middle, there's this hull. This hull is called the external auditory canal, which sometimes can be filled with lots of cerumen or very little cerumen, depending on how things go. But cerumen's just made of like skin flakes and antimicrobial stuff. Goodness. It does curve just a tiny bit. So if you remember when somebody is inspecting the inside of your ear, your doctor is inspecting the inside of your ear, they usually take a quick yank on that helix to stick a little scope in it. It's just to help deal with that little bit of bend so they can see this thingy right here called the tympanic membrane. And tympanic membrane is also called your eardrum. Why is it called an eardrum? Well, because when you hit things against it, it does jiggle just like a drum. But fortunately, we're not going to stick anything in there that would cause it to jiggle like a drum. Mostly, we're just letting noises hit it to cause it to jiggle. If we do hit things against it, like a loud noise or a soft noise, we do cause it to jiggle. These 3 things here, these 3 auditory ossicles. If you remember our discussion back in AMP1, ossicle or anything with osteo in it should make you think bones, and that's exactly what it is. These are the 3 smallest bones in your body, and they do like to jiggle along with the tympanic membrane when it drops its beat. Man, that's a dorky joke, but I'm not restarting this recording. Something to note about this here bone right here called the malleus is directly connected to this tympanic membrane. When you take a look-see into somebody's ear, you can see just barely a little bit an attachment site onto that tympanic membrane, a little bit of a white yellowish structure. That would be your malleus. Malleus means hammer, which kind of is convenient because the thing that it's attached to through a diarthrotic joint is called the incus, or also called the hammer. So you're taking the hammer and dropping it on an anvil. You are a blacksmith. In fact, you're a blacksmith on both sides of your head. And what are these 2 cranking out? Well, they're cranking out these little stirrups. Well, at least I call them stirrups. They look like little stirrups for horses. Where do horses hang out? In staples. Okay, that was a little bit of a stretch, but horses hang out in staples and stapes. That bone is called a stape bone, which is actually where the middle ear ends, or where that foot is like inserting into, where this little long oval-shaped thingy right here is inserting into an oval window is where the middle ear sort of ends and the inner ear begins. Some things to point out about the inner ear before we go on too far is this thing called the tensor tympani muscle. When you're expecting some type of loud noise, or you do hear a loud noise, this muscle is going to tense up this malleus bone and make certain it doesn't jiggle as easily. It's a way to protect this really sensitive organ. Because what this setup is to do is to amplify noises. So if you over amplify it, you're going to damage stuff on the inside that you don't want damaged. Another thing to note is this little auditory tube. Yes, you got a nice little tube that is going and descending down into your nasal cavity. Convenient if you want to maintain and monitor pressures, especially if you go scuba diving. You might have Remember some moments where you had to pop your ears, or maybe when you were ascending up in a plane, you had to pop ears. That's a way to help make certain that airy space stays at a nice, comfortable pressure. If you can't pop them, it's a very uncomfortable feeling. Adults, we got a nice steep auditory tube. Children, not so much. It's more of getting closer to a little bit more perpendicular to the ground, which kind of explains if you got a nose infection. Adults don't really have those ear infections very so often, but children often do at the same time. Speaking of which, here's what you're looking at what the doctors are usually looking at to try and see if you got some type of ear infection. They pop that little stethoscope into your ear. Not stethoscope, that's a weird thing to put in your ear. Their little device into your ear to take a look, see what's inside. And there's a nice, lovely, healthy, normal eardrum tympanic membrane with a auditory ossicle attached to it. In here, the acute otitis, aka the swimmer's ear, you're going to see that some gunk has gotten in, some bacteria's maybe found a place to hang out, and it's starting to cause an inflammatory response, which isn't a very happy place to be. It's a very uncomfortable feeling inside that ear. You can also have liquid building up in your middle ear through that auditory canal, which you can see here. We got lovely little air bubbles hanging out right in here. That's not such a great, wonderful feeling to have. I did mention a little bit about the inner ear that we might be talking just a tiny bit about equilibrium. This is where that's coming in, just a tiny bit, but we're talking about hearing mostly still. Now, I'm mentioning the inner ear and I'm putting it out like it next to a snail because it looks like a snail to me. And the part that we care about, this snail shell for now, is the hearing portion, while the snail head and its antenna is more of the equilibrium stuff. For my March 2023 course, this is the slide that you're going to be seeing for the very last. You're going to be honored to see this slide for the very, very last time. I'm going to delete this thing. It's a little wordy. It's just telling you again that because the cochlea, the snail shell, is the one that interprets the noises caused by that causes the vibrations, while the vestibula and the semicircular canals are the ones responsible for equilibrium. The rest of y'all are going to just have this slide. So it's a nice broken down internal ear, has a bunch of labyrinths in it, with the cochlea again interpreting sound. It's the part that looks like a snail shell. The rest of it that looks like the snail head is actually called the vestibule, and its antenna, the snail antenna, looking like a semicircular canals. All of which together, well, makes the sense of equilibrium. It helps us sense equilibrium. Now that we're here, let's go ahead and just point that out. There's my snail antenna. There's my vestibule up here. And then down here, well, oopsie whoopsie, we got a snail that did not do so well with life. Its snail shell got cut in half. But we know that this portion is, in fact, the cochlea, the part that we're actually doing for hearing. Some of you might go looking up on this corner because you're trying to ignore my stupidity. There's and notice that this says the vestibulocochlear nerve, and go, oh, wait a minute, I'm putting two and two together. If this is the vestibule, this nerve is interacting with the vestibule, and then there's the cochlear branch of the cochlea, which is interacting with the cochlea. Holy guacamole, vestibulocochlear canal nerve. No wonder why they don't call it the auditory nerve, because it also senses equilibrium, or conveys information of equilibrium. Holy guacamole, what a wise, bold move. I'm glad they didn't name it after some weird dude, though, that found it or figured this out. I appreciate that very much. Anyways, let's go ahead and focus in on how hearing works. This little canal here is just filled with a liquid that's very salty, very similar to cerebrospinal fluid, called perilymph. It has a lot of potassium in it. Like all liquids, when you try to make it pressurized, it doesn't do that. So it just kind of jiggles, which is or makes waves, sort of like the ocean. The waves are like pressures of water fighting against each other, and the wave is winning. If you do, what's going on here is we're taking advantage, or our bodies are taking advantage of that changes in liquidy goodness and how it changes into waves by jiggling the tympanic membrane, jiggling the bone so that it can actually push that liquid. Now, how I can go into a bit of detail here a little bit later as how this jiggles and all that stuff, but I do want to point out at this point, the closer you are to this oval window, the tighter this membrane is, and it's harder to jiggle. So it requires a really high frequency to jiggle. I'm jiggling your high frequency points right now. I'm so sorry. But if I go Barry Manilow, or yeah, is it Barry Manilow? I have no idea. Oh yeah, if I go nice and low, I'm jiggling down further this here shell. Now, why is that important? Well, down in between all these membranes that they're pointing out, the vestibular membrane, tectorial membrane, and basilar membrane, there's a couple of liquids as well as some specialty cells attached to it. In particular, it's attached to that basilar membrane are some specialty cells called inner hair cells. Are they actually hair? No, but they look kind of hairy if you put them under an electron scanning microscope, and it's kind of cool. Now, what's going on here is that these basilar cells, are they neurons? No, they're definitely not. But they're attached to neurons, and they can send signals to these neurons when they want. How do we get them to send signals? Well, they got stereocilia on them that are like attached to each other through a protein ribbon, and that protein ribbon is attached to a tectorial membrane. So when you jiggle the perilymph out here or out here, this basilar membrane goes shaky, shaky. The support cells and the stereocilia go hula, hula. And underneath these stereo cells that are going hula, hula are some little holes that potassium totally takes advantage of, sneaks in, depolarizes these cells, which in turn causes these cells to release neurotransmitters onto the actual neurons, which say, hey, this particular stereo cell is hearing things or getting jiggled. I'm going to go tell the brain that things are getting jiggled. And it goes down into the cochlear branch and then joins into the vestibulocochlear nerve and then goes to different places, like maybe you remember the inferior colliculus that we talked about, where it determines if we're going to pay attention to a noise that we heard off to the side or not. But of course, it goes up to the thalamus, where the thalamus goes, we should do something about this, and sends information to the primary auditory area within our temporal lobe. With that, that is the end of our hearing discussion. Thank you so much, and good luck on your studies.